Hey guys, it's Joe here. Two organizations I've been zeroing in on lately are one, the Bank of International Settlements, and the other is the United Nations. And in particular, I'm interested in their relationship to Canada. Here on the screen, I have the Sustainable Development Goals for the United Nations Agenda 2030. These were originally the Millennial Development Goals of Agenda 21. And Agenda 21 sought to implement its goals by the end of the 21st century. Agenda 2030 is looking to achieve its goals by 2030, just 11 years from now. And as you can see, they have some very ambitious goals. No poverty, zero hunger, not a reduction of zero. Affordable and clean energy, decent work, and economic growth. And those all sound like really good things. But should we have confidence, or do we have reason to have confidence in the United Nations' ability to achieve these goals? Because as far as I can tell, they're just the latest in a long line of utopian dreamers who are looking to reshape mankind, much like the experiments that happened in the 20th century with communism, fascism, Nazism. And we saw how those all turned out. And those were all veiled and dressed up in virtuous sounding, feel-good rhetoric. And it seems like people have a propensity to fall for this stuff. So here on Canadian government websites, we have the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. In September 2015, Canada and 192 other UN member states adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The 2030 Agenda is a 15-year global framework centered on an ambitious set of 17 sustainable development goals. And this was brought in under the Harper Conservatives. Now, as you saw, those are some very lofty and ambitious goals. And in order to even attempt to try and achieve them, they're going to need a lot of money. Taxation has a key role to play in financing the Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, an era of unprecedented international cooperation on tax is underway with the implementation of automatic exchange of information, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, and the strengthening of the United Nations Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters, all creating new opportunities for the enhanced participation of developing countries in international tax policy discussions and institutions, but also new challenges to fully realizing the benefits of international cooperation on tax. It is in this context that the Platform for Collaboration on Tax was formed. The platform partners International Monetary Fund, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, United Nations, and the World Bank have each worked for many decades to support their member countries to effectively mobilize tax revenues. So again, here we have the private banks coming in, looking to get their cut of our tax revenues, and this time on a global scale. Now shifting here to more recent times, in December, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau signed Canada on for the Global Compact on Safe and Orderly and Regular Migration. And Canadians were not consulted on this. We did not vote for this, but nonetheless, we have been signed on to this, and very few Western nations actually adopted this compact. I say about half a dozen at the most. There's about, I think, 28 Western Bloc nations, and the majority did not sign on to this. So what is the United Nations Compact on Global Migration? Considered a historic achievement and the first globally negotiated cooperative framework to cover all aspects of migration, the Global Compact on Migration aims to improve the cooperation of international migration in order to make migration work for all. It draws attention to the challenges that irregular migration poses, while also emphasizing the positive contribution of migrants and the benefits of regular pathways and well-managed migration systems. The compact sets out 23 objectives, each focusing on one aspect of migration. Each of the objectives is supported by a list of best practices that states can draw from to achieve the Global Compact on Migration objectives. So here's the 34-page document outlining the objectives of the Global Compact on Migration. And where we weren't consulted beforehand, Canadians didn't have an opportunity to effectively argue this. And now that it's been adopted, we still can't. And in fact, it's even written into the Global Compact on Migration that any dissent against this initiative would be censored. Under Objective 17, eliminate all forms of discrimination and promote evidence-based public discourse to shape perceptions of migration. Behind the politically correct language, this is political correctness on steroids. Censorship on steroids. Promote independent, objective, and quality reporting of media outlets, including internet-based information, including by sensitizing and education media professionals on migration-related issues and terminology. Their politically correct jargon, in other words. Investing in ethical reporting standards and advertising and stopping allocation of public funding or material support to media outlets that systematically promote intolerance, xenophobia, racism, and other forms of discrimination towards migrants, and full respect for the freedom of the media. They just throw that last part in there as like a final snub. Now, again, they use all this virtuous sounding language that they're trying to protect and rid the world of racism and intolerance and xenophobia. And again, it sounds good in theory, but it's beyond the scope of their abilities. All of this stuff is beyond the scope of human abilities. But in our era of decadence, humanity, largely in the West, has convinced itself that it can do this, or I should say the elite consensus. In Canada, we call it the Laurentian elite consensus, is that we can achieve this utopia in 11 years. So, by and large, this is probably the picture that most people have in their heads when it comes to the United Nations. I know I did for many years, and I remember going around at Halloween with those UNICEF boxes, and I shudder now just thinking about it, honestly. And what we typically see in their shiny public relations campaigns is a celebrity with a white savior complex surrounded by black and brown children. And we're led to believe that they are to be entrusted with these children and have their best intentions in mind. But from what I'm seeing, I have all the reason in the world to doubt that. The scale of sex abuse at the hands of United Nations workers could be huge. The shocking fact is pedophiles target aid organizations. Sexual exploitation and abuse is not a problem of peacekeeping. It is a problem of the entire United Nations. Contrary to the information spreading that this is a question related to our peacekeeping operations, it is necessary to say that the majority of the cases of sexual exploitation and abuse are done by the civilian organizations of the United Nations and not peacekeeping operations. If the majority of cases are outside of peace operations, the admitted 311 cases in peace operations are less than half the reported victims in a single year. The total may be well over 600 of known victims. In the United Kingdom, about 14% of rapes are reported. If we assume slightly less rapes are reported against the United Nations, a safe assumption given the environments in which the United Nations works, and assume 10%, then that 600 victims could represent 6,000 real victims in 1 year, many of whom are children. And that could mean 60,000 in a decade. So a new case came up on my radar thanks to Rance Derrick. I wasn't aware of this, but back February 17th, 2018, pedophile Peter Newell had key role in child charity, and this is from the Times in London. A child's rights activist, in quotations, convicted of abusing a 12-year-old boy, managed a charity that received hundreds of thousands of pounds from the NSPCC. Bernardo saved the children and UNICEF. Peter Newell, who wrote a manual on children's rights, published by UNICEF, was jailed for multiple counts of historical sexual assault on a child aged 12 when the abuse began. Newell, 77, was listed as coordinator for Approach, a children's charity active across Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia until the allegations arose in 2016. And just to pause here, remind the point I'm trying to drive home here is the elite consensus is that the United Nations is the standard bearer on how to progress forward in the 21st century. Why should we trust these people? Now, a case I brought up many times on this channel, and I had to bring it up again, is that of former UN official and Order of Canada recipient Peter Dalglish. And have you ever noticed these guys all look the same? They're all these old buzzard-looking guys with bags under their eyes and gross yellow teeth and beak faces. They're disgusting. But here's Peter Dalglish with our boy Justin Trudeau, longtime Trudeau family associate, worked for Pierre Elliott Trudeau when he was Prime Minister, and received the Order of Canada in 2016 specifically for his work with an organization called Street Kids International. These are not isolated incidents, the ones that we hear about in the end. Peter Dalglish was arrested in Nepal, where he was detained for 25 days. He confessed and then recanted, was the last that I had heard. I'm not sure where that case stands right now. But I think at the very least, his Order of Canada award should be up for dispute or rescinded. This is disgusting. And no one's brought this up. No one in the political class is speaking out to condemn this. And that case of Peter Dalglish, that came out in the spring. And early last month in January, another case of very similar circumstances came out. An Ottawa man awaiting trial on child pornography charges late after he returned from a trip to a Nepalese orphanage has been granted bail. Paul McCarthy, 62, is charged with 2 counts of possessing child pornography, 1 count of luring a child under 18, and 1 count of importing child pornography. He was granted bail at the Ottawa courthouse on Wednesday and is expected to make his appearance next February 6th. And I have not seen anything in the news about that February 6th appearance. This is the most recent information I can find on this case. And these stories just get buried. They make a blip on the radar and then they go away. But here we have 2 cases within 10 months of 2 Canadian children's aid workers, one an Order of Canada recipient, both of them working in orphanages in Nepal for international aid organizations, arrested for child pornography and pedophilia. And the Ottawa Citizen, in covering the story on Paul McCarthy, went on to state, in October, the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund issued a warning pertaining to orphanages in Nepal. The organization said as many as 85% of the children in Nepalese orphanages aren't actually orphans and have at least one living parent. More than 75% of the country's orphanages are located in high tourism areas, sex tourism areas. The organization said, in some cases, children are deliberately separated from their families and placed in orphanages so they can be used to attract money from donors or Johns. Background checks are often not conducted on volunteers. This can increase the risk to children of sexual exploitation, UNICEF said on its website. Well, doesn't that instill you with confidence? Not quite. There is a darkness that lurks within the United Nations, and it's ominous. But like everything else, it's dressed up and packaged up in politically correct rhetoric to make it sound like it's virtuous and wholesome and is for the benefit of all. And I just simply do not believe it, nor do I think we have any reason to believe it. And I want to mention down below, there's a petition to adopt that Canada re-examine its United Nations commitments and have consideration before moving forward with any other action with the United Nations, given what we know about the United Nations, but what the mainstream media constantly covers up and glosses over. And as you saw in the Compact for Global Migration, even in their agreements, it dictates what the media can and can't tell us about the initiatives. So go down in the description below, guys. Check out the links down there. You can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. I have a merchandise link set up as well, and lots of links for the People's Party of Canada. The People's Party of Canada leader, Max Bernier, is sponsoring the petition against the United Nations. And the People's Party of Canada is the only political party in Canada that is being outspoken. The only one with a leader in Parliament that is outspoken against the United Nations' further encroachment and further erosion of our national sovereignty. Every time that we sign on to one of these, quote, non-binding agreements that they make such a big deal of, we're conceding sovereignty. Again, it's wrapped up in veiled, politically correct language, so it doesn't appear that way, but ultimately that is what's happening. And more you hear politicians on both sides of the aisle, Michelle Rempel constantly going on about our UN commitments and how we have to meet our UN targets. They don't care about Canada. None of them do. No one in the neoliberal, neoconservative, Laurentian elite establishment cares anything for Canadians. And as I explained before, they do this all the time. Here, the Stephen Harper Conservatives signed Canada up for Agenda 2030 and then passed the torch to Justin Trudeau to sign us on to the Global Migration Compact. In 1974, Pierre Elliott Trudeau allowed the Bank of Canada to become part of the Bank of International Settlements, allowing foreign private banks to issue loans to the government at compounded interest, causing our national federal interest debt to skyrocket, and then passing the torch to Brian Mulroney in 1992. He got rid of our fractional reserve banking requirements so that Canadian banks don't have to hold any cash reserves to issue a loan. And the Fraser Institute estimates as of 2017, our total combined debt to interest debt to banks is $1.4 trillion. That's why there's no money for anything that we ask about: schools, roads, hospitals. The money's going to private banks and the United Nations, and which we saw at the beginning of this video, is just controlled by private banks: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, Bank of International Settlements. So please share this video, guys, far and wide. We need to make an attempt to get people to take notice of what's happening and that our rights and freedoms are being taken away by unaccountable, unelected, bureaucratic elites, international elites. The political class in Canada, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and the fake opposition, Andrew Scheer, they are United Nations administrators. That's all they are. We need a way for the people of this country to have a way to get back into the political process and take back what is ours. Take back our tax dollars from the private banks. Thank you, everyone. My name is Joe, and I am Canadian.